Well, I want to get started. I want to welcome everyone to another edition of SIBA's Reader Meet Writer. I am your host, Wiley Cash. I've been with you for a lot longer than we all thought I would be. We started doing these events way back in the spring of 2020 when the coronavirus began canceling people's book tours. And so we brought authors to you the best way that we could. They cannot be in your store, so they are coming to you on your computer screen. Normally, you would be going to see a writer like Margaret Renkl at a bookstore near you. Well, now she is in your kitchen or your living room or your office or wherever you are watching this from. All of these events have been brought to you by SIBA, which stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. This is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps one of these bookstores is the reason that you know about tonight's event. If that is the case, please consider buying this wonderful book from the bookstore that brought you here tonight. Independent bookstores are the lifeblood of our literary and cultural communities, and let's do everything that we can to support them. As I said, tonight's guest is Margaret Renkl. We're going to be talking about her new book, Graceland at Last, that just came out about a week ago, if I'm not mistaken. If you have questions about anything that Margaret and I are talking about, or anything in the book, or her earlier book, or any of her columns, please go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question in. It will not interrupt us one bit at all. I won't even notice it until the end of the show when I open that little box and I'll see your question. When you type it in, make sure you mention your name and the name of your home independent bookstore, and I will ask Margaret your question at the end of our show. So please do that as the feeling strikes you. We have one upcoming event, and this feels really self-indulgent, but it's my event. My new novel, When Ghosts Come Home, comes out September 21st, which is this coming Tuesday. And I have an event on Thursday, September 23rd, right here with Reader Meet Writer. I'm hosting my own event, and I'm going to be in conversation with JD Jackson, who is the audiobook narrator of When Ghosts Come Home. I'll be coming to you live from an empty bookstore, Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you register and attend that event, you'll be entered in a drawing by Libro FM to win 3 free audiobooks. That event is supported by Libro FM, and of course, SIBA is bringing that event to you. So thank you so much to SIBA, JD Jackson, Libro FM, and all the bookstores that are supporting that. But that's not until next week. This week, tonight, we have a very special guest, and this is the kind of guest that the people who put these events together, myself, Nikki, and Linda Marie, have been talking about since we found out that she was going to be joining us. We've been very excited and really looking forward to it. And by the numbers of registrants, I think a lot of people have as well. Margaret Renkl is the author of Late Migrations, A Natural History of Love and Loss, which was published in July 2019. Her new book is Graceland at Last, Notes on Hope and Heartache from the American South. She is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, where her essays appear each Monday. She's a graduate of Auburn University, the University of South Carolina, which I know well, and she lives in Nashville. And I am so thrilled, Margaret, that you are with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here, and also so amazed at you, how you can possibly have time to read my book, talk to me about it, finish up everything that's going on with your book, and teach at the same time.
Well, I do all of them not well, so it's actually easier than you think. I do all of them on like a 2. So
I don't buy it. I don't buy it.
That's how I appear to be successful. So, we're here to talk about your wonderful book. And can you tell us a little bit about this book and how you came to put these essays together?
Well, I'm happy to report that it was not my idea, because it would have seemed a little, I don't know, kind of bold for somebody like me to think, oh, I'm just going to make a book out of these things that I've just been writing, for a newspaper on a weekly basis. But there's a book development department at the Times, and the editor of the book development department thought this would be a good idea. And the more she talked about it, the more I thought, well, maybe that could work. So the question then became, what kind of overarching or governing theme would hold these essays together, as given that they've been written over 4 years' time and cover a lot of territory. This is probably 20 or 25% of the essays I've written for the Times. So it's not comprehensive in any way, but I started looking at what combination of stories, of essays, would present the most nuanced and complex picture of the American South. And that's sort of how we ended up where we are now.
And I want you to read a little bit, but can you tell us maybe how the essays are organized thematically around a couple of themes like family, politics, different things? Can you tell us do you think thematically when you're writing, like, oh, this is going to be one of my family essays, or this is going to be one of my flora and fauna essays? How do you approach that when you're thinking thematically about an essay? And did the themes, the way in which these essays are arranged in the book, did they reveal themselves easily?
Well, I just started with my mandate at the Times. When they first invited me to write on a regular basis, they were trying to figure out the little tagline that would go with my description. And I had been writing for them just on a purely case-by-case basis about a lot about nature. And so flora and fauna naturally came to mind. And I'd also written a good bit about writing and music and other aspects of cultural life in the South. So that came up, and then they threw in politics, because if they were going to have somebody down here, they needed somebody who was willing to wade in. And so my tagline is sort of flora, fauna, politics, and culture of the American South. And so those are the organizational principles I started with. But then I realized that some things that other people consider to be political, I don't really consider to be political. I don't see that they have any reason to be divisive. And so I set those apart as social justice issues. I pulled them out of the politics section. And then I realized, well, you can't really write about the Bible Belt without addressing faith of some kind. So I threw in some religion. Anyway, it just kind of evolved.
Sure. That's so interesting. I love how you broke it down, and it kind of gets you in the mindset to, when you wade into these sections, it kind of gets you into a thematic mindset to look for a through line through the essays. I think it was a wonderful way to organize them. Will you read an excerpt from one of the essays for us?
Well, I know what you're going to ask me after I read a little bit, so I picked one that I thought would illustrate the question that you've warned me is coming. This might not be the one I would normally choose to introduce new readers to this book, but it's from an essay called "An Act of Mercy in Tennessee." And it's about a young woman named Centoya Brown, who was convicted of murder. She was basically enslaved to a pimp as a 16-year-old girl, and she killed with his gun one of her what we would now recognize as a rapist, one of her pimp's clients. And she received a really ridiculously severe sentence. And she became a kind of a national celebrity. And there was a lot of pressure on then Governor Bill Haslam, a Republican, to commute her sentence. And much of that pressure, as you might imagine, did not come from the governor's own party. Mm-hmm. As a rule, it came from liberals, which made what he did all the more astonishing. So I'm just going to read the very end of that essay. It's from, if you have the book at home, it's on page 116. It's called "An Act of Mercy in Tennessee." The piece ran at the very end of Bill Haslam's second term as governor on January 14th, 2019. And I start out by naming some, in this part, leading into this part, I'm naming some of the celebrities and some of the Democratic advocates who were putting pressure on the governor. And then I say, he commuted Ms. Brown's sentence anyway. It was an act of mercy, according to Ms. Brown, and she thanked the governor in a statement. I will do everything I can to justify your faith in me. In this country, we like to profess outrage at the primitive understanding of justice at work in other parts of the world, at the hangings, at the beheadings, at the murder sentences for extramarital affairs. But we live in a country where children can stand trial as adults and where our immigration policy includes separating nursing infants from their mothers pleading for asylum. Not everyone in other parts of the world adheres to such harsh notions of justice. And not everyone here adheres to harsh border control measures. There will always be disputes about what justice means. As a country, we continue to get many questions of right and wrong, entirely wrong. We seem to be a long way from knowing the difference between a crime motivated by evil and a crime motivated by profound fear or desperation or mental illness or cognitive disability. We're a long way from understanding that the death penalty is not a deterrent to crime, a long way from recognizing that racial bias pervades our criminal justice system so thoroughly that despair is more common in many of our communities than justice will ever be. But there is hope when the governor of Tennessee chooses mercy and understanding over the strict letter of the law. There is hope when a young woman can walk out of prison into the light of freedom after 15 years behind bars for a crime she committed as an endangered and exploited child. We may never agree on what real justice looks like, but we will always know mercy when we see it, and mercy will do.
No, that's such a beautiful closing, such a tough essay and such an amazing chapter. I remember that case very well, and you write about it so beautifully in the book. So that leads to my next question. You're a writer who's become synonymous with the American South, and I've read where you've written that there are so many Souths. It's hard to be synonymous with the South, despite what my T-shirt says, as if it's a unified South. But because you write so beautifully and so truthfully about the South and the situation and the climate that we often find ourselves in. But that being said, as you look back over these essays, is there something in them, maybe the governor's response, for example, but is there something in these essays or in your memory of the experiences that birth these essays that continues to surprise you about the South?
I started this weekly assignment believing that my job was to make people recognize how often Southerners defy the stereotypes of being a Southerner. And yet I find myself often surprised when we do just that. I think that I am as surprised as anyone. I was shocked when Bill Haslam pardoned Centoya Brown. And what that tells me is that there is a lot more hope for political nuance here than anything in our national media tells us is possible. And things that happen all the time that are surprising people. It surprised everyone that Georgia flipped to blue in the 2020 election, except the people in Georgia, who had been laying that groundwork for a really long time. And, the people in Texas came pretty close. We are a multifarious region, and even our most hidebound and hardened separations can be permeable sometimes, and people can do the right thing even when the right thing is not politically expedient, even when the right thing comes with a great, at some great cost. And that gives me that is what beats back despair in me more than anything, is to be reminded again and again of how complicated human beings are. And Southerners are no different from anybody else in that in that regard.
Well, one thing that really courses through many of these essays is how connected we all are in the South, regionally, culturally, geographically, especially when dealing with things like voting rights or climate change. We are literally in the South, especially in this together. And I love what you just said about, Georgia being the only, population that wasn't surprised that it went blue. And what do you think about it? What do you think it is about the connectivity of the South that allows those of us who live here to not despair, right? To not look around and say, sea level rise, oh, well, it's just going to happen. Or, you write so beautifully about climate change in your neighborhood, oh, well, invasive species, it's just going to happen. But in the South, because we're so connected, do you think that keeps us from despairing?
I think people are connected everywhere, honestly. I think, I don't want to give the impression that I think Southerners have some kind of a regional specialty in helping their own neighbors or in, loving each other despite some pretty severe disagreements on certain issues. But we are in this region, Black and white, and I think Latino too. We are a people who tend toward a kind of ancestor worship, and so this is what that translates to in the national media tends to be, white supremacists waving the Confederate battle flag. But what it really means in real life is that there's a generational kind of detente that happens where people who leave the farm, leave the small towns, leave the rural areas and go to college or move to the city for a job, they are transformed. And the divide is really not north-south anymore. The divide is between the people who live in urban areas and the people who live in rural areas. And yet you can't help but love your people. And so when you love your people, you haven't given up on them yet. We haven't given up on each other yet. Somebody said to me on Twitter last week, somebody who is taking severe issue with what I wrote in my column last week about how Republican governors can't be trusted with public health anymore. That needs to be federalized. She wrote, all I can say is I'm going to pray for you. And I wrote back and said, and I'm going to pray for you too. I think that's what we have to do. Yeah. She's hoping I'll come around and I'm hoping she'll come around and we'll just both keep working on it.
I love what you said about ancestors. And, I know that you grew up with ancestors culturally in terms of your family, but also culturally as well. And I certainly did. But then I went to college and I went to graduate school and studied under Ernest Gaines, a Black writer from Southwest Louisiana. And my ancestors changed, right? I had these different cultural ancestors that I chose, right? Can you talk about that experience for you? Now you're in Nashville, you've moved around, you've been to school, you've done some of the things that you referenced earlier. Can you talk about any evolution and that you feel like you went through as a writer or a thinker or as a citizen?
Well, I think I was a little bit, I don't want to say unique, but my family didn't follow that classical, uneducated, educated trajectory. My grandmother went to college and her father took her to the train on a mule. So it was not that, I was the first person in the family. My mother went to college, her brother went to college. They were country people through and through, but they believed in higher education and so that was maybe a little bit different. And I don't know that the way I thought about things follows what I would call an evolutionary path, because that implies a transfer from one state to another. I think what happened was I got to college and graduate school and I got kind of asinine. I started thinking I knew more than I knew. And I forgot that those old ways of doing things had some wisdom in them too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would call it less an evolution than a kind of constant growing, because I did kind of come around to realizing that there was a lot of beauty and a lot of truth in some of those old ways.
Yeah, I love that story about your grandmother and the mule. When I brought home my first college girlfriend and my dad met her, he told her that his grandfather had owned a mule who also went by that name. So that's how that went. So I want to talk about some of the essays specifically before we start taking questions. And maybe while we're talking about them, in the interest of time, if you can think about, I'm always so curious, especially with nonfiction writers, when you approach the idea of an essay, how do you enter the space to write it? What is your intellectual eye looking for? Are you looking for an image? Are you looking for a snap of dialogue? Are you looking for a theme? What are you kind of looking for in kind of a spiritual, intellectual space when you begin to write?
I think all of those things. I have a more or less running list of things I might want to write about. And so I'm keeping notes and saving links to relevant research or news events in a document with those topics that sometimes those links are long since expired by the time I get around to writing about that topic. I'm always looking for something that happens in the news that would make it timely. And sometimes I'm looking for the thing I'm always looking for the thing that will make somebody else see it and hear it and feel it. And I do think that as much as I can, I'm trying to tell a story. It's not the kind of story you're telling, because it has to be done in a really short, a really compact space. And it can't be even a fraction as nuanced. But I do believe strongly that the way to persuade people is to tell them a story that touches them. Not every column, not every essay is open to that possibility. Sometimes it just needs to be a bullet train argument that makes a point and gives examples and tries to be persuasive just on a purely logical level. But other times it's possible to move around in the sensory experience that will bring something to life for a reader, ideally, or to set a scene that makes it possible to enter a space where they might hear something and think about it in a way they hadn't considered before.
Hearing about something and consider it in ways they may not have considered it before. I want to give you a major shout out's the wrong word, but just the acknowledgement that you are a wonderful literary citizen, because in the essay Reading the New South, you discuss several Southern periodicals and the ways in which they're reframing perceptions of the South. And not only was that an incredibly kind thing to do, to mention many of these publications, many of them new, especially at the time you were writing about them, but acknowledge the fact that some of us across the South who are natives or transplants or however we want to frame ourselves are interested not in reframing the South, but in adjusting the way the South is perceived by people who are from here and not from here. And do you see your own, if you can talk about that essay and the idea of that, but do you see your own work in doing that as well, reframing the perception from the outside and the inside?
That's my hope. I don't always have very much confidence that that's what I'm doing. I don't know whether to be happy about this as a sign of something or sad, but I seem to make as many people on the left angry as people on the right. I think that probably suggests that there's some muddling of delineations there. Maybe I'm saying something that people don't want to hear. If when we had catastrophic flooding in Tennessee, you would not even believe how many people in the comment section on that essay talked about how basically we deserve to drown down here because we don't believe in climate change. Mm-hmm. The lack of nuance in that position is stunning to me, because it suggests that you think everybody here has the same view of that. And it suggests that you think that a political position is punishable by death. And they had nothing at all to say on that subject when more people in New Jersey and New York died in flooding the very next week, mm-hmm. as died here. And so what I would love to hope that it's possible to complicate people's perceptions, but I do think people on both sides of the aisle are pretty strongly committed to their views, and it takes a lot to budge them.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's power in polarity, and there's nuance in the middle, and trying to suss some of these issues out. And I want to ask about the closing essay, if I may, and the idea of mirrors. In the closing essay, Graceland at Last, you discuss the ways in which the mirrors in the house in Graceland, which you finally make it to at last, you discuss the ways in which the mirrors inside this house that surprises you in some ways allow you to kind of see yourself where you are in your life at that moment, but it also allows you to consider yourself where you were when you thought you were going to Graceland and that trip across the mountain with the cat on your head and all of that really funny image.
Yeah.
It's just such a beautiful metaphor. It's such a beautiful way to shoot a through line through the essay thematically. Can you talk about mirrors? And do you feel that when you look back over these essays, which even though you're oftentimes not writing about yourself, they're little mirrors of your life. They're little mirrors of the moment. They're little mirrors, or little snapshot mirrors of life in the South or wherever you're writing about. Can you talk about that? And as much, and I've seen you, I've read where you write about, the burden of feeling like people outside the South may perceive you as the voice of the South. And you've said that's impossible. There's too many Souths. But in mirroring, do you feel the pressure of representation of people from the South that you're mirroring out to the larger world? That was a complicated question.
Well, I will have to confess, Wiley, that those mirrors were not symbolic, at least not deliberately so. There are mirrors all over Graceland. I mean, everywhere. It's crazy.
Well, he was a handsome man. I mean, if I were that handsome,
yes,
I have no mirrors in my home.
Oh my gosh, it was hilarious how many mirrors there were there. But I like the way you're thinking about that, because in a way, that's a description of the whole project of the personal essay as a genre. Really, it's the hope that what underpins that genre. I don't want to say for everybody, because I sure can't speak for all the essayists of the world, but for me and for the essayists whose work I love, the idea is not that here I had this remarkable thing happen to me, listen to my story. That's never what's going on. What's going on with the personal essay is, here's my experience. And the goal is to write it in a way that makes somebody else see their own experience there too. Or even if it's not a mirror experience, to use your analogy, it's at least permission to regard for the reader to regard his or her own experience as worthy of contemplation and recording in writing. And I think that's a lot of what the personal essay is as a genre. It's an expression of, here's my heart, and then it's an opening of conversation, a crossing of liminal spaces, reader to writer. At its best, it doesn't always work that way.
Oh, yours work, believe me. That's why we're all here. They work. So if you're okay to take some questions from the audience, we've got quite a few questions that have stacked
I'd love
up.
to.
Okay. This question is from Dabney. Local bookstore is Scuppernong Books in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's a fantastic bookstore.
Hi,
and Dabney asks, Margaret, curious if you have done any exploring around Suwanee, Tennessee, not too far from you. And if so, your thoughts about the campus. I went to college there, and it really cemented my deep love for an appreciation of the natural world?
I don't see how you could go to Swanee and not come away with a deep appreciation and recognition of the natural world. I consider myself an honorary citizen of Swanee. I wrote much of my first book at a writer's colony that was on the bluff overlooking Lost Cove, right outside on the domain of Swanee, but right outside the campus. And it was called the Rivendell Writers Colony. It doesn't exist anymore. It lost its funding, but I have friends who have a cabin up there who've been very generous to my husband and me to let us borrow it whenever the noise and the fret of living in Nashville get to be too much. It's just a great place it is quiet and it is peaceful. And you can see why everybody there believes that it is imbued with the spirits, because it has that to see that mist rising up, the fog rising up, the famous Swanee fog rising up out of Lost Cove, is to believe that you're in touch with something otherworldly.
I got to turn my South card in. I've never been to Sewanee. Isn't that terrible?
Oh gosh.
I know.
It's Swanee, it is, I think maybe the 5th largest in terms of landmass college or university in the country. It's huge, the land, and it's got a trail, 24 I think mile trail that goes around the perimeter of the campus. That, I mean, it's wonderfully biologically diverse and stunningly beautiful.
We have a question from Joe, and Joe wants to know what was the response. He mentions the comment section, if you want to wade into that, but what was your response to the response on your August New York Times piece? The point is the people in the South are suffering.
Well, that's the one I referenced. I referenced earlier in our conversation. My response is to remain silent. I don't respond to the comments. The comment section exists for readers to converse with each other. I'm sure I would be welcome to weigh in if I cared to, but there's no good comes of that. It's better to learn from what people are saying, to just see take the temperature of readers and then let that process unfold on its own. I believe it's not good for anybody's mental health to get tangled up in all that.
I totally agree with you. That's why I only look at Goodreads 3 times a day. Anne wants to ask, Goodreads is like the locker room of American literature. They're like popping authors with towels and giving them wedgies and all kind of stuff. Anne wants to know, why do you think the South is especially reverent of, even captive to their ancestors?
I imagine it has something to do with having lost the war. When people have lost something that matters to them, they cling to what remains. But I tell you the truth, it's just a guess. I didn't grow up in a family that gave or at least in any way discussed the Civil War. That was not a topic of conversation that came up in my extended family. I'm sure my grandparents and my great-grandmother had opinions about it, but nobody was saying, oh gosh, the South will rise again in my family. So I don't really, I'm just taking a guess on that.
Yeah, I actually found myself wondering that exact same thing today. Was it like the displacement of an entire economic system? I found myself wondering that exact same thing.
It's a bunker mentality that happens when you're under siege. I think it's happening right now. I think that bunker mentality explains a lot about the rise of Donald Trump.
I think you're right. So Joanna from Louisville, Kentucky, Carmichael's Bookstore. Joanna asked, of all the different subjects that you cover in your column, flora, fauna, politics, religion, etc., which of those subjects comes most naturally to write about, and what is the hardest?
Hi, Johanna. The easiest ones to write about are always my backyard nature pieces, because that's my solace. That's the when I come to a stopping point, or when I just can't get any further in what I'm writing, I just poking around in the pollinator garden is a morally unassailable way to procrastinate. So that may, and things are always happening out there. Summer, winter, it doesn't matter. Things are always happening out there. So stories are always waiting to be told. The hardest is probably politics, just because I have always been a fanatical follower of politics, but I'm always beset by insecurity when I have to write about politics, because there are people for whom that is a full-time job and who are better equipped than I am, who understand the historical underpinnings of what's going on better than I do. But that's part of the description of my space in the paper. So I do it.
We have a question from Caroline. Caroline's home bookstore is Bookmarks in Winston-Salem. And Caroline asks, can you talk a little about your book's beautiful cover?
Oh, I would love to talk about my book's beautiful cover. I'm gonna hold it up. These, you have to get pretty close to see that this is not one piece of one contiguous thing. It's made of little strips of antique postcards. And my brother, who is a collage artist, Billy Renkl, he teaches at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. He did the cover and the internal artwork for Late Migrations, and he did this cover too. And he worked with the art director at Milkweed Editions, Mary Austin Speaker, who's a brilliant art director. And she together, they came up with this approach. It's little pieces. When you get close, you see that it's from postcards about this region, but it tries to cover everything: the mountains, the fields, the cities. It's all hinted at in there.
Anissa has a question for you. Anissa asks, what are you most proud of as an author? I love your writing.
I think I know which Anissa is writing in, and Anissa is an indefatigable promoter of books and literature and reading, and I am also grateful for everything you do, Anissa. The thing I'm most proudest of, to be honest, I've never even given that any thought. I think I go through every day just trying to hang on by my fingernails, getting through all the obligations of this life. I haven't really had a chance to remark to myself on how wild it is, I guess, that after, teaching for 10 years and working as a freelance writer for 10 years and being a full-time editor for 10 years, suddenly I'm an author. And, my first book came out when I was 56 years old. I guess if I thought about that, that would be pretty strange.
Well, this next one is a great question to end on. And this question comes from someone, I think it is Fegan. Fegan asks, do you have a meaningful international reader base? I moved from Istanbul, Turkey to Huntsville, Alabama 8 years ago. And I learned a lot about the South from your New York Times essays. And Fegan's home bookstore is the Snail on the Wall in Huntsville, Alabama.
Well, if I do have an international readership, it would be because of the Times, because the New York Times is everywhere. At the moment, so far, neither of these books has been published outside the United States, although Late Migrations has a publisher in Great Britain, and the book will be coming out there sometime in the next year. But there is an international edition of the New York Times, and sometimes my essays are in there. It's not an every week thing or anything, but I don't tend to hear from readers like that. It tends to be a pretty domestic crowd.
Well, from Istanbul, Turkey, all the way to Huntsville, Alabama, we brought them to you tonight. Well, Margaret, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for spending some time with us and taking time for these questions. And thank you for everybody. We had a huge crowd. Thank you so much to everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate it, Margaret.
Well, thank you, Wiley, and thanks to all the bookstores in the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. I wish I could be there with you in person. I love every one of you.
Well, thank you. And please join us next week for my event. Well, I'll be hosting audiobook narrator JD Jackson, who has narrated my novel When Ghosts Come Home, that'll be out on Tuesday. The event will be a week from tonight, 7 p.m., right back here on SIVA's Reader Meet Writer. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great night.